Have you ever heard a father whisper his last will, not in a lawyer's office, but through a phone call laced with fear, to a daughter he suspected might be the only one left he could trust? Not a will written on paper, not even a video message, just a voice. Tired, cracked, terrified. If anything happens to me, don't let Nick inherit a dime. You hear me? Those were the words Rob Reiner, legendary director, actor, and icon of Hollywood's golden era, reportedly told his daughter Tracy Reiner in what may have been his final, desperate attempt to protect his legacy from his own son. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Moments later, the line went silent. And hours after that, he was gone. So was his wife, Michelle, murdered, brutally, in their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. And the person charged with their murder? Their own flesh and blood, Nick Reiner. But this story isn't just about a crime. It's about fear that grows inside a family like rot under marble floors. It's about a father's final attempt to reach out, not to save himself, but to save what mattered. It's about a daughter who got the call, but not in time. And it's about what happened next. Because what we're about to uncover is more than just another Hollywood tragedy. This is the slow unraveling of a dynasty, the collapse of everything that once looked perfect from the outside, and the truth that had been hiding in the guest house all along. The night Rob Reiner died, the headlines came fast. Reiner family tragedy. Son charged in double homicide. Hollywood royalty rocked by brutal crime. But none of them told you what you're about to hear. None of them mentioned the voicemail that Tracy Reiner played on loop for hours after her father's death. They didn't mention that the first person on the scene, Romy Reiner, Rob and Michelle's youngest daughter, allegedly told police, "You should look at Nick. He's dangerous." And they certainly didn't talk about the document Rob had filed just days before, one that mysteriously vanished. Now ask yourself, if a father knew his son might kill him, what would he do? Would he hide the silverware? Sleep with the door locked? Call his daughter and beg her to keep the fortune out of his son's hands? Or would he keep pretending, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands at fundraisers, directing movies with the same calm charm he was known for? The truth is, Rob Reiner did all of it. Because by the time the murder happened, the storm had been building for years. Let's rewind. Rob Reiner wasn't just anyone. He was a titan in the industry, son of comedy legend Carl Reiner, creator of cult classics like Stand By Me, When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men, a fierce political voice, a family man, a patriarch. From the outside, untouchable. But inside the Reiner mansion, something dark was brewing. And Rob knew it. He just didn't know how fast it would all come undone. Or maybe he did. Tracy Reiner had always been close to her father. As his daughter by marriage to Penny Marshall, she grew up in a web of A-listers and late-night writing sessions, of film sets and studio meetings. But in the last year, something had changed. Their calls became longer, more serious, more paranoid. And then came the voicemail. A voice not of a director or celebrity, but of a man in fear. If anything happens to me, don't let Nick inherit a dime. You hear me? Was it a joke? A bitter comment from a father about a spoiled son? Or was it something far more serious? Tracy wasn't sure. At least, not at first. But when the bodies were discovered the next morning, when blood soaked the marble hallway, when Michelle was found with a phone still clutched in her hand, Tracy knew. This wasn't just a warning. It was a prophecy. The police report would say it began sometime after midnight. A disturbance call. No forced entry. No signs of robbery. Just violence. Controlled. Targeted. Intentional. And in the guest house, Nick Reiner, 32 years old. Calm. Clean clothes. Sitting on his bed with a cold cup of coffee. When the police asked what he was doing, he reportedly said, "Waiting." Waiting for what? No one knows. But what happened next shook even the most hardened detectives. Tracy arrived minutes after Romy, and when she saw the scene, her father's body, her stepmother's lifeless frame, the blood, the silence, she didn't cry. She whispered, "I was too late." Then she handed an officer her phone and said, "You need to hear this. We'll get to that voicemail. We'll walk through every word, every second. But before we do, you need to understand the full picture. Because this wasn't just a one-night tragedy. This wasn't a sudden explosion of violence from an otherwise peaceful home. This was years in the making. A son living in his parents' guest house, reportedly without paying rent. A family increasingly divided. Tracy and Romy on one side. Nick, alone, isolated, angry, on the other. Whispers of past drug use. Financial arguments. Inheritance threats. A will rewritten, then rewritten again. And somewhere in the middle, a man who knew the walls were closing in. So let me ask you again. If you knew your son was dangerous, if you feared he might do something unthinkable, would you call your daughter and plead with her to protect the family legacy? Would you hide the will? Would you sleep with one eye open? Or would you do nothing? Rob Reiner didn't do nothing. He made that call. He left that voicemail. And what he said in those final moments will echo forever. Not just in the Reiner family, but in every courtroom, every news story, and every soul who's ever feared their child might be capable of something monstrous. But what came next? That's what will leave you in tears. Because the truth didn't just emerge. It screamed. And it started with a blood-soaked message, a missing document, and a daughter who was about to become the keeper of her father's final wish. But what she found just days later would shake the entire family to its core. Because what Tracy found days later wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't explode across headlines. It was quiet. Too quiet. And that's what made it terrifying. What if the thing that scares you most isn't what you hear, but what suddenly goes silent? That's the question Tracy Reiner kept asking herself as the hours after her father's death blurred together. The mansion was sealed off. Yellow tape wrapped around wrought iron gates that had once welcomed senators, actors, donors, and directors. Now, only police, forensic teams, and hushed whispers. And Tracy stood there thinking about one thing. Not the blood, not the cameras, not even Nick. The voicemail. Because when she played it again, alone this time, she noticed something she'd missed before. Not the words. The pause. There was a gap in the recording. A few seconds where Rob wasn't speaking. And in that gap, a sound. A faint one, like someone else breathing. Let's slow down. Because in stories like this, everything feels obvious in hindsight. But in the moment, nothing is clear. Tracy didn't arrive as a detective. She arrived as a daughter. Shocked, numb, running on adrenaline and instinct. Police asked her standard questions. Where had she been? When was the last time she spoke to her father? Did she notice anything unusual recently? She answered automatically, but her mind was somewhere else. Replaying that call, his voice, strained, rushed, almost rehearsed, but not quite. If anything happens to me, what kind of father says that casually? What kind of man with everything, money, power, legacy, leaves a message like that unless he's afraid? And afraid of whom? That part, Rob didn't say out loud, but he didn't need to. He said the name, Nick. The police would later describe the crime scene as controlled, not frenzied, not chaotic, no signs of forced entry, no ransacking, nothing missing, which means whoever did this wasn't there to steal. They were there for one reason only. And when Tracy heard that detail, her stomach dropped. Because control was exactly what her father had been trying to regain in the months leading up to his death. Control over his estate. Control over his will. Control over his son. Here's something most people don't know. Rob Reiner had quietly begun restructuring his assets. Not publicly, not through flashy announcements, but behind closed doors. Trusts, conditions, clauses, contingencies. And according to people close to the family, one name kept coming up again and again during those meetings. Nick. Why? Because Rob didn't just fear Nick's behavior. He feared what Nick would do if he felt cut off. If you're a parent, let me ask you something. What's worse? Believing your child is capable of hurting someone else, or believing your child might hurt you? Rob Reiner had reached the point where that line no longer felt clear. Nick Reiner lived in the guest house on the property, close enough to hear the main house at night, close enough to watch, close enough to wait. And according to multiple accounts, arguments between father and son had become frequent. Not shouting matches, something colder, sharper, silences that stretched, conversations that ended with doors closing instead of voices rising. Those are the dangerous ones. Because anger that explodes is visible. Anger that calcifies, that hides, that festers. Now let's talk about Romy. Because Romy Reiner wasn't supposed to be the one who found them. She wasn't meant to walk into that house. But something felt off. Calls unanswered, messages unread, and a gut feeling that wouldn't go away. So she went. And what she saw changed everything. She later told police there was someone in the family who should be considered dangerous. That's not something you say lightly. That's not something you say unless fear has already crossed into certainty. And when detectives asked her who she meant, she didn't hesitate. Back at the station, investigators listened to Tracy's voicemail. Once, twice, again, and that's when one of them paused the audio, rewound it, enhanced the background. That faint sound Tracy had noticed? It wasn't static. It wasn't interference. It was movement, a shuffle, a breath, as if Rob wasn't alone when he made the call. Now think about the timeline. Rob leaves a warning. Hours later, he's dead. No signs of forced entry, and a son who lived just steps away. Coincidence? Or confirmation? At this point, the media hadn't yet turned the story into spectacle. There were no talking heads, no theories trending online, just a family locked in rooms, giving statements, while the truth pressed in from all sides. And Tracy? She wasn't crying anymore. She was thinking, because grief doesn't always come as tears. Sometimes it comes as clarity. Here's the contradiction that would haunt her. If Nick planned this, why didn't he run? Why stay on the property? Why wait? Some say it showed innocence. Others say arrogance. But there's another possibility. What if Nick didn't think he'd get caught? What if he believed everything had already been handled, including the will? Yes, the will. Because within 48 hours of the murders, something else surfaced. Or rather, didn't. A document Rob had referenced weeks earlier, one he'd told Tracy about in passing, couldn't be found. Not in the safe, not in the office, not with the attorney who'd been working on it. It was as if it never existed. And that raised a question no one wanted to ask out loud. If Rob feared Nick enough to leave that voicemail, what else did he do to protect himself? And who knew about it? Tracy began replaying their last conversations. Not just the call, the weeks before it. Her father had been distracted, guarded. He'd asked strange questions. Who had access to the house? Who knew about the safe? Who knew where documents were kept? At the time, she thought it was age, stress, politics. Now it felt like preparation. And then came the detail that pushed everything over the edge. A police officer quietly told Tracy that during the arrest, Nick had said something odd. Not a confession, not a denial, just a sentence. You'll understand eventually. Understand what? That was the moment Tracy realized this wasn't just about money, or inheritance, or resentment. It was about power, about control, about a son who felt erased, and a father who tried, at the very end, to stop what he believed was inevitable. Ask yourself this. If you knew something terrible was coming, if you felt it in your bones, who would you call? A lawyer? The police? Or your daughter? Rob Reiner chose Tracy. And that choice may be the reason this story didn't end quietly. Because what Tracy decided to do next, it wasn't public, it wasn't dramatic, but it would set off a chain reaction no one saw coming. She stopped trusting appearances, stopped trusting silence, and started digging. But what she uncovered first wasn't in the house. It wasn't in the guest house. It wasn't even on the property. It was hidden in a place no one thought to look. And once she found it, there was no turning back. Because the next revelation wouldn't just confirm her father's fears. It would prove he hadn't been paranoid at all. He had been right. But what came next would change everything. And no one was ready for it. What would you do if your father left you a message that sounded like a goodbye and a warning just hours before he was found murdered? The Reiner house had always been a symbol of prestige. A sprawling Brentwood estate draped in ivy and secrecy. It was where screenplays were written, campaign fundraisers were held, and Hollywood royalty passed glasses of wine beneath golden chandeliers. But on the night of December 14th, it became something else entirely. A crime scene. And the first signal that something was very, very wrong wasn't the sound of sirens. It was a voicemail. A father's final plea to his daughter. If anything happens to me, don't let Nick inherit a dime. You hear me? Let's rewind to 10:32 p.m. That's the time Tracy Reiner's phone lit up. She didn't answer. She was in the middle of putting her young child to bed, her phone face down on the counter, silenced like always when she was in mom mode. It wasn't until almost midnight that she noticed the missed call. It was from her father. Just one. No follow-up texts. No second attempt. She remembers staring at the screen, that familiar contact photo of Rob grinning wide, one eyebrow raised in mock judgment. A face she'd seen 1,000 times. But something about it felt off. She pressed play on the voicemail and instantly froze. Rob's voice was different. It wasn't calm. It wasn't warm. It wasn't filled with his usual mix of sarcasm and wisdom. It was short, shaky, almost breathless. If anything happens to me, pause. Don't let Nick inherit a dime. You hear me? Click. That was it. No explanation. No goodbye. No context. Just those two sentences. In a silence that somehow felt louder than anything Tracy had ever heard. Now ask yourself, what would you do? Would you panic? Call him back? Rush over? At first, Tracy did what any child might do when they think their parent is just being dramatic. She brushed it off. She assumed it was a misunderstanding. Maybe a drunken message. Maybe Rob had watched something on the news, gotten emotional, and called her in a moment of paranoia. Because this wasn't the first time he'd expressed concerns about Nick. But it was the first time it felt like a warning. And by the time she called back, no answer. Not from Rob. Not from Michelle. Not even from the landline. She paced for nearly 30 minutes, calling again and again. Each time, voicemail. She considered driving over. She didn't. Because a part of her still didn't believe anything could be truly wrong. After all, this was Rob Reiner. A man who'd survived the chaos of Hollywood, politics, and his own demons. A man who'd built legacies, guided generations, shaped culture. But just before she went to bed, something made her pause. She played the voicemail again, and again, until she couldn't deny it anymore. This wasn't just a warning. It was a man trying to say goodbye. The next morning, everything unraveled. News broke slowly. A rumor on Twitter. A message from a family friend. Then the call from Romy. Shaky, breathless, panicked. Dad and Michelle are dead. You need to come now. Time folded in on itself after that. One moment Tracy was grabbing her keys. The next, she was standing in the driveway of the estate, surrounded by flashing lights and yellow tape. And the last words her father ever said to her? They were now evidence. The voicemail would eventually become central to the investigation. Tracy handed it over willingly, but not before she made her own copy. Because she couldn't let it disappear. And because a part of her, no matter how irrational it sounded, feared someone might try to erase it. You see, Rob Reiner was no ordinary victim. This wasn't some anonymous tragedy in a forgotten suburb. This was a man who carried weight, power, wealth, and more importantly, secrets. And those secrets were about to come crashing to the surface. Investigators listened to the voicemail over and over. At first, they were puzzled. Why leave a cryptic message like that? Why not call the police? Why not name Nick directly? But Tracy knew. Her father didn't want to cause a scandal. He didn't want headlines. He didn't want his family turned into a circus. He just wanted protection from the person he once held in his arms as a baby. From his only son. Nick Reiner had always been a wild card. Bright, charming, but volatile. He'd struggled with addiction, been in and out of rehab, clashed with his parents over money, treatment, and responsibility. And in recent months, something had changed. He'd grown darker, more reclusive. There were whispers of late-night outbursts, doors slamming, conversations that ended in threats. And when Rob told Tracy, if anything happens to me, he wasn't speaking in hypotheticals. He was speaking from fear. Let's pause here, because this is the part of the story most people miss. Rob didn't just make one call that night. He made 3. One to Tracy, one to his estate lawyer, left unanswered, and one to Michelle, his wife, even though she was just upstairs. Why? Because she wasn't answering either. They were both afraid, and they were both isolated, in their own home, surrounded by luxury, haunted by their son. Inside the guest house, Nick was awake. Police later confirmed he was online, browsing Reddit, watching a YouTube video about legacy lawsuits, and searching terms like contested wills and inheritance after death. He left behind a digital footprint that investigators would follow like breadcrumbs through a nightmare. And at 1:14 a.m., his phone pinged, just once, from the main house's Wi-Fi. That was the moment detectives believed the murders took place. A silent walk across the garden, a door left unlocked, a conversation turned confrontation, and then silence. But let's bring it back to the call, because everything comes back to that moment. That breathless message, the choice of words. If anything happens to me, don't let Nick inherit a dime. Not if I die. Not if something goes wrong. Not if I get hurt. No, if anything happens. That's the voice of a man who knew something was coming. Not hoping, not guessing, knowing. You can hear it in his voice. The way the words tremble, not from age, but from something heavier. A weight pressing down on his chest, a fear he couldn't shake, and a trust placed squarely in his daughter. Not in lawyers, not in police, but in Tracy. Because Rob didn't just want Nick cut off. He wanted him erased from the family's future, from their finances, from their legacy. And now that Tracy held that message in her hands, she had a choice. She could protect it, or she could act on it. She chose the latter. But first, she had to face her brother. Not in court, not in public, in private, inside a visitation room, just days after his arrest. And when she looked him in the eyes, she didn't see guilt or remorse. She saw something worse. Calm, like he'd been waiting for this moment all along. And when he leaned forward, smiling faintly, he said only this. "You heard the message, didn't you?" That moment shattered Tracy's world. Because it meant one thing, and one thing only. Nick already knew. He knew about the voicemail. He knew about the will. He knew what Rob had done. And what Tracy was about to find next would prove this had been in motion far longer than anyone realized. What she found was hidden in plain sight. And it changed everything. From the outside, they were Hollywood royalty. But inside the Reiner family mansion, love had quietly turned into fear, and trust into a ticking time bomb. What does it look like when a family begins to break? Not all at once. Not in an explosion, but piece by piece. It starts small. A disagreement at dinner. A cold stare across the room. One voice rising. Another one leaving the table. And then silence. But in the Reiner household, that silence wasn't peaceful. It was dangerous. The Reiner name was golden in Hollywood. Carl Reiner had laid the foundation. Rob built the empire. He brought us Stand By Me, When Harry Met Sally, The Princess Bride, A Few Good Men. Films that defined generations. Stories that connected families. But no story inside his own family could match what was about to unfold. Because behind the public smiles and red carpet appearances, the Reiners were coming apart at the seams. And the center of that fracture was Nick. Let's talk about Nick Reiner. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand who he was and who he wasn't. Nick was born into privilege. That's the truth. Private schools, elite therapy programs, access to power, opportunity, and money from the day he was born. But by the time he turned 13, there were already problems. Behavioral issues, suspensions, angry phone calls from administrators. Then came the drugs. At 15, his parents checked him into a private rehab facility in Arizona. At 17, he ran away. At 19, he was back in LA, living in the guest house on the Brentwood estate. And by 25, he was nearly unrecognizable from the boy who used to ride bikes down Sunset Boulevard with Romy. But here's where things got complicated. Rob still loved him, and that's what made everything so tragic. There's something painful about watching a parent try to protect a child who won't stop hurting them. Rob tried everything. Therapists, detox centers, screenwriting projects. He even produced a film based on Nick's addiction recovery. He poured time, money, and effort into saving his son. But nothing stuck. Nick didn't want help. He wanted control. And when he couldn't get it emotionally, he went after it financially. The first serious confrontation between father and son happened in 2022. Nick had discovered that Rob was restructuring his will. Not removing him, just protecting the estate, adding clauses, setting up staggered inheritance payments, placing more decision-making power in Tracy's hands. Nick took it as betrayal. He lashed out, accused Rob of manipulation, said his sisters were turning him into a villain. But what really got under his skin was the idea that Rob didn't trust him. And from that day forward, things changed. Inside the mansion, Michelle became withdrawn. She stopped hosting dinners, stopped smiling in family photos. She started locking her bedroom door. In a private journal, later recovered by detectives, she wrote, "He stares through us now. Not at us. Through us. I don't know who he is anymore." She was talking about Nick, but she never said his name. That was the unspoken rule in the house. Don't provoke him. Don't confront him. Just manage him. Now imagine this. You're living in a 10,000 square foot estate with a home theater, an art collection, and a $3 million kitchen renovation. But you're afraid to go to sleep at night. That's what Tracy would later describe to investigators. She said her parents began keeping the security system armed. Even during the day, Rob had the locks changed. Not once, 3 times. And Michelle insisted on installing a second bolt inside their bedroom, something that required drilling into 100-year-old mahogany doors. She was willing to damage history to feel safe. That says everything. But no one wanted to go public, because the Reiners weren't just any family. They were legacy. Reputation mattered. So they kept the dysfunction in the shadows, until the shadows started pushing back. In late 2023, just months before the murders, Rob reportedly confronted Nick again. This time, it wasn't about money. It was about respect. He told Nick to move out. That's what sources close to the family claimed. They said Rob finally reached his limit, that he told his son, "You can't keep living off our fear." And Nick's response? He laughed. A cold, flat, humorless sound. Then, allegedly, he walked out and slammed the door so hard it cracked the frame. Now let's shift perspectives. Because this isn't just a story of a father and a son. It's also about the sisters. Tracy and Romy, 2 daughters watching their family splinter under the weight of secrets no one wanted to admit out loud. Tracy, the responsible one, the fixer, the one Rob confided in when he began rewriting the will. And Romy, the quiet one, the observer, the one who saw too much and said too little until it was too late. In an interview after the murders, Romy reportedly told investigators, "I always felt like we were pretending, like we were actors in a play called Perfect Family." She said there was tension every time Nick was in the room. Not loud, but sharp, like something about to snap. She noticed how her mother's posture changed around him, how Rob's voice dropped to a whisper when discussing finances, how Tracy kept her phone on her at all times whenever she was visiting the house. And she noticed the locks, the double-locked bedroom, the panic buttons installed behind artwork, the camera's position not outward, but inward. Who does that? Who installs surveillance facing inward? Someone afraid of the people already inside. Now, back to the night of the call. The night Rob said, "Don't let Nick inherit a dime." He wasn't just talking about money. He was talking about legacy, about reputation, about safety, about erasing the risk that had lived too long in the family's shadows. And in that call, he wasn't just warning Tracy. He was passing the torch. He was saying, "You have to finish what I started." But the tragedy? It was too late, because the war inside the house had already turned deadly. The tipping point had come. And the thing no one wanted to admit? Rob may have known it would end this way. In that journal entry Michelle left, the one found weeks later, tucked inside a jewelry box, there was a line that still sends chills down the spine of every person who read it. "If we disappear, don't let him tell the story." It wasn't a poem. It was a metaphor. It was a plea. And so now, the question turns to you. What would you do if you were Tracy? If you got the call? If your family was unraveling and your brother may have been the one pulling the thread? Would you protect him? Stay silent? Try to forgive? Or would you step into the fire, knowing you might be burned? Tracy made her choice. She stepped forward. And in doing so, she uncovered something that had been buried beneath the estate for years. A secret, a betrayal, and a set of documents her father never meant for Nick to see. What those documents revealed would rewrite everything and tear the family apart forever. What do you find when you open the door to the one room no one ever dared to enter? In the Reiner estate, that room was the guest house, and what it held would chill even the most seasoned investigators. Every mansion has its secrets, but not all of them live behind locked doors. Some sit right outside the main house, in plain sight, nestled beneath Spanish tiles and climbing ivy, just far enough to feel separate, but close enough to hear everything. At the Reiner estate, that place was the guest house, a modest 1,200 square feet by Brentwood standards. But make no mistake, this wasn't a pool house for visitors. It was Nick's kingdom, his domain, his lair. And from that space, hidden just beyond the main home's garden, the true unraveling began. Let's rewind to the morning after the murders. Police swept through the main house methodically, room by room. They found signs of a struggle in the hallway, blood in the foyer, Rob's body near the staircase, Michelle's collapsed near the fireplace. But what stood out most? No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no smash locks, and no defensive wounds on either victim. That's rare in knife attacks. And it suggested one thing. They knew their killer. They didn't scream. They didn't fight. They didn't run. They froze. Because they recognized the face walking toward them. So where was Nick? In the guest house, where he had lived for nearly a decade. Police found him there just hours later, sitting on the couch, wearing clean clothes, shoes off, watching something on YouTube, an old movie clip. He looked up, blinked, said nothing. An officer reportedly asked, "Did you hear anything last night?" Nick shrugged. "No, slept fine. But let's be honest, something wasn't right." The police knew it. And so did Tracy. So once the bodies were removed and the house cleared, attention turned to the guest house. And that's when the real story began. Because what they found inside wasn't just a messy room. It was a map, a blueprint, a time capsule of obsession, rage, and plans. Start with the walls. Dozens of post-it notes. Not scattered, organized, color-coded, taped in rows. Each one labeled with phrases like, "Trust no one. Asset freeze equals betrayal." She watches, but she won't stop it. Rewrite. And pinned to the center, a photo of Rob, torn in half, his side of the image ripped across the mouth. On the desk, a spiral notebook, filled cover to cover with what investigators described as manic scrawlings. Some entries looked like scripts. Others were rants. One read, "They think they can erase me, but I'm the only real one. They're props. Fake. Cut me out, and I cut back." Chilling. But it didn't stop there. Beneath the bed was a locked metal box. Inside, court documents, wills, old copies, handwritten annotations in red pen. Nick had been collecting versions of the estate paperwork for years. Some had obvious forgeries added in. Others were scribbled with what looked like plans, timelines, possible dates. One page had a simple phrase underlined 7 times. December 14th equals freedom. Pause. Let that sink in. December 14th, the night Rob and Michelle were murdered, was marked in Nick's personal notes as freedom. Coincidence? Not likely. Especially considering what else was found just a few feet away. A folder titled Contingency. Inside, a printout of Rob's recent property transactions, information about offshore accounts, a list of passwords, some legitimate, some guessed, and in one chilling entry, "If the old man locks me out, take it back. By any means." But perhaps the most disturbing discovery? A voice recorder. Small, cheap, almost overlooked, until they pressed play and heard Rob's voice. Not in a message. In a conversation. A conversation he never knew was being recorded. In the clip, Rob is speaking to Michelle. He's not listening. He thinks I'm bluffing about the will. But I'm not. I'll do it tomorrow. We can't keep living like this. Michelle's voice responds. "He's dangerous, Rob." Then silence. Then, suddenly, footsteps. Then a click. The recording stops. Who turned it off? We don't know. But the device was found hidden behind a loose panel in the guest house wall. Nick had been listening. Recording. Studying. Let's talk about motive. People argue that Nick snapped. That it was a sudden burst of rage. But what the guest house revealed was premeditation. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a plan. A strategy. Executed with chilling calm. Even the kitchen told a story. Food wrappers. Expired meds. Energy drinks lined up like trophies. A dry erase board with reminders. Get knife sharpened. Midnight equals clean path. Stay calm. And above the fridge? A printed copy of the Reiner family crest. Burned at the edges. Someone had tried to destroy it. Symbolically, perhaps. Or maybe it was practice. Now let's rewind one more time. Tracy had always had suspicions about the guest house. She never liked going near it. Said it gave her a weird feeling. When she visited the estate, she avoided walking past the garden path that led to Nick's door. And she told Rob, many times, to make Nick leave. But Rob wouldn't. Couldn't. He felt guilt. Responsibility. Love. Even fear. And that fear was what killed him. Because fear makes you hesitate. Fear tells you to wait. To hope. To pray it doesn't get worse. Until it does. After the search of the guest house, police presented the findings to Tracy. She didn't flinch. Didn't cry. She just nodded. And whispered. He was already gone. Meaning Nick. Meaning the brother she once loved. The one who shared Christmas photos, movie sets, and family dinners. That version of him. Gone. Replaced by whatever lived in that guest house. Whatever stared back in those walls. Whatever took the family's love and twisted it into something monstrous. But here's the thing. The guest house didn't just confirm guilt. It raised more questions, because mixed in with the ramblings and rage were references to something else, to someone else, a third party, a possible accomplice, a manipulator, a name scribbled again and again. TR knows. TR, the initials of Tracy Reiner. Was Nick suggesting Tracy was involved? Or was he obsessed with her? Was he blaming her? Or warning about her? Detectives couldn't be sure, but they knew one thing. Whatever Nick had planned, it wasn't finished. And the guest house was just step one. And here's the final twist. As they were wrapping up the search, an officer noticed something odd. A floorboard, slightly raised. He pried it open, and beneath, a flash drive, labeled Family. No password, just one folder. Inside, 6 video files, all silent, all showing footage from hidden cameras placed inside the main house. Rob and Michelle, eating dinner, arguing, watching TV, being watched by their own son. And the final clip was time-stamped 11:57 p.m. on December 14th. It showed the hallway, Rob walking toward the kitchen, and a shadow, tall, slow, deliberate, moving behind him. Then static. End of file. So let me ask you again. What lives in the places we pretend are safe? In the ghost houses, the back rooms, the garden paths we don't walk anymore? Sometimes it's not just dust and memories. Sometimes it's danger. And sometimes it's family. But what Tracy would discover next would take this story far beyond Brentwood. Because while Nick may have kept his secrets in the guest house, Rob had his own hiding places too. And what was buried beneath the floorboards of the main house would turn this case upside down. What would drive a man to rewrite his will twice in the final weeks of his life? And how could that very document vanish just hours after his death? The morning after Rob and Michelle Reiner were found stabbed in their Brentwood home, the questions came fast. Why wasn't there any forced entry? Why had no one heard screams? Why was Nick so calm? But the question that changed everything? Where was the will? Because in a house filled with art, luxury, and layers of legacy, the most valuable item wasn't a painting. It was a decision. Rob's final decision about who would carry on the Reiner name and who would be cut out entirely. Let's go back 2 weeks before the murders. Rob made a quiet trip to his lawyer's office. Not his public attorney, not the one the press knew. A private estate specialist. No cameras, no entourage. Just one man in a ball cap and dark glasses, clutching a sealed folder. That folder contained a revised will, his third draft in less than 2 years. And according to legal assistants present, Rob's instructions were clear. I want my daughters protected. Nick is not to receive 1 cent unless he gets full psychological clearance and signs off on treatment. But there was more. A trust, set up exclusively in Tracy's name, empowering her to oversee everything if Rob and Michelle died suddenly. Not in 10 years. Not at old age. Suddenly. Why would a man nearing 80, still in good health, emphasize suddenly so many times in one document? Because he felt something coming. Not in his body, in his home. And that sudden death clause. That was his way of sounding the alarm. It was legal armor against the unthinkable. A final move in a chess game he hoped he wouldn't have to play. But the board was already set. 3 days before his death, Rob received confirmation. The will had been updated, signed, notarized, digitally archived. A hard copy was sent to his house via courier. But when detectives asked Tracy to produce it the day after the murder, it was gone. Not in the office. Not in the safe. Not in Michelle's files. Gone. Tracy froze. Because she'd spoken to her father about that very document just days earlier. And he had said one thing that now haunted her. Don't let Nick get his hands on it. Now here's where things get weird. When investigators pulled security logs from the Brentwood Mansion's smart system, something stood out. At 2:11 a.m., just hours after the estimated time of death, someone had accessed the office. The log showed the keypad entry, but no name, just a 4-digit code. That code matched one of only 4 people in the house. Nick. And what was in the office? A safe. And inside that safe, Rob's latest will. Or at least it had been. Because when police opened it later, they found only an empty folder. No documents. No digital copy. Just a single post-it note with a chilling message. Try again. Handwritten. And when Tracy saw the handwriting, she went pale. Because it was Nick's. Why would Nick destroy the will? That part's obvious. Because it disinherited him. But how did he know it existed? That's the question no one could answer. until Tracy remembered something. 6 months earlier, she had walked in on Rob and Nick mid-argument. She hadn't stayed to listen. But she remembered one line, Rob raising his voice and saying, "You'll see what's in the new will. Then we'll talk." She thought it was bluster. Now she knew it was a mistake, because Rob had warned Nick, and Nick had taken that warning as a threat. At this point, the case was growing darker by the day. Evidence was stacking, but still no will, which meant Rob's previous will, the one from 5 years ago, was still legally binding. And guess what? That one split the estate equally, including Nick. Even worse, it included language that gave Nick access to physical property, including the guest house and all designated documents within the home. Meaning, if the new will didn't surface, Nick still had a claim to money, to assets, to power. And that terrified Tracy. So she did something bold, something no one saw coming. She called the estate lawyer directly and begged him, not for legal help, for a copy, a single copy. She said, "If there's anything, please send it." But there was a problem. The lawyer's office had been broken into that same night. No signs of theft, no smashed windows, just a drive wiped clean. And the only files deleted? Rob's. Coincidence? Or cleanup? Theories exploded across the media. Some said Nick had help. Others said this was bigger than one man. But the truth was simpler and darker. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase Rob's final wishes. And they almost succeeded. Until Romy remembered something. A strange conversation with her father. About backup. Not on a computer. On something older. Something simple. A USB stick. The next day, investigators swept the house again. This time, focused on small places. Drawers. Trinket boxes. Hidden compartments. And in a false bottom beneath Rob's nightstand, they found it. A black flash drive. No label. Just the word trust scratched into the side with what looked like a key. They plugged it in. And there it was. Rob's final will. Scanned. Dated. Signed. And backed up with a video recording. In the video, Rob sits at his desk. It's grainy, lit by a single lamp. He's tired, calm, but clear. "This is my final will. And if you're watching this, it means something happened to me." He takes a breath, then speaks directly into the lens. "Tracy, you know what to do." He ends with one final line. A whisper, almost. "Don't let Nick inherit a dime. You hear me." And then it cuts to black. That flash drive changed everything. Legally. Emotionally. Publicly. Because now, Nick wasn't just accused of murder. He was accused of motive. Of erasing evidence. Of trying to rewrite history. But history had receipts. And that flash drive was Rob's final defense. Let me ask you, if you feared your own child, would you spend your last days fighting to protect what you built? Or would you give up? Rob didn't give up. He fought with every ounce of legal maneuvering he had. And he hid the truth in the one place no one thought to look. A drawer. Not filled with valuables, but with vengeance. But just when Tracy thought the worst was over, another discovery sent shockwaves through the case. Because in the files on the flash drive was one more document. Unfinished. Untitled. Just a single page with one name. Tracy. And one sentence beneath it. "If I die, she knows why." What did it mean? What had Rob told her that he hadn't written down? And what memory was Tracy about to unlock? That would change everything. Because it wasn't about the will anymore. It was about what came before the will. And the person Rob feared may not have been working alone. What would you do if your father's murder left you holding secrets he never dared write down, and people started following you before the funeral? Tracy Reiner was never supposed to be in this position. Not the executor. Not the investigator. Not the shield for her family's name. She was the quiet one. The daughter who stood just outside the spotlight. Who worked behind the scenes. Who raised her kids, made independent films, and called her father every Sunday without fail. But when that voicemail came, "If anything happens to me," something inside her shifted. This wasn't about grief anymore. It was about protection, and something else. Obligation. Because in Rob's final days, Tracy wasn't just his daughter. She was his last line of defense. Let's go back to the day after the will was recovered. Tracy watched that video a dozen times. Paused it. Rewound it. Studied every blink, breath, and pause. And what haunted her most wasn't the message. It was what wasn't said. The fear in his eyes. The hesitation, like he wanted to say more, but couldn't. Like he knew someone else might be watching. So she started asking herself the question no one else dared to voice. What if this wasn't just Nick? What if someone helped him? What if this went deeper? The first clue came in the form of a name, a document on the flash drive. Never meant to be read by lawyers or courts. It was a letter, half finished, written by Rob, addressed to T. The handwriting was rushed, uneven. The date in the corner? Just 4 days before his death. It read, T. If you're reading this, then something happened. I hope you never see it. But if you do, you have to follow the trail. Start with what was signed in 2017. You'll find it in the ledger. Use the red key. Be careful who you trust. He isn't alone. That was it. No signature. No details. Just enough to set off 1,000 alarm bells in Tracy's mind. That was the year everything began to shift in the family. Nick had moved back into the guest house after his 3rd rehab stint. Rob and Michelle had started quietly revising their estate plans. And according to Tracy's memory, something else had happened. A visitor. A man. Not family. Not friend. A financial advisor. Or so he claimed. She'd only seen him twice, but his name stuck. Gavin. Gavin J. Price. She remembered it because she'd Googled him back then. There were no real results. Just a LinkedIn page that felt fake, with a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. And now, Rob's notes seemed to be pointing her back to that year, to whatever began with Gavin and ended in blood. So Tracy went back to the estate. Not the main house, not the guest house, the basement, Rob's private study, untouched since the night of the murders. She had the red key, the one he always kept on a chain around his neck. And when she used it to unlock a steel cabinet buried beneath old movie reels and scripts, she found it. The ledger, a thick, leather-bound book with Rob's handwriting on the spine. Inside, a list of investments, transfers, names, and one entry circled 3 times. G. Price, $4 million. Confidential. See contract A17B. She flipped to the back. Taped to the final page was a thin manila envelope. Inside, a signed contract. And the signature next to Gavin's? Nick Reiner. Why would Rob invest $4 million through someone he didn't trust? He didn't. That's what Tracy realized. Nick did. Rob had been trying to claw it back ever since. The contract had been voided, but not before the money vanished. That explained the panic, the urgency, the sudden rewrites of the will. And it explained why Rob had told Tracy. It's not just him, it's who he's listening to. Now Tracy had something bigger than family drama. She had a conspiracy, a money trail, and a motive that went beyond inheritance. So she did what Rob used to do when preparing for a role. She went method. She hired a private investigator. Not just any PI, one recommended by an old contact in the DA's office. Discreet, experienced, expensive. She gave him everything. The ledger, the contract, the note, and one directive. Follow Gavin. Meanwhile, Tracy began noticing something strange. Her phone would light up with missed calls, no numbers. Her emails would unsend themselves. Her car alarm would trigger at random hours. At first, she thought it was her imagination, until she spotted the man, twice in 1 week. Same clothes, same parking lot, just sitting, watching. And the second time, you followed her for 6 blocks. She didn't go home that night. The PI's report came back 3 days later. Gavin J. Price wasn't real. The name was an alias. No tax ID, no verified address. But his face popped up in surveillance footage from the Reiner estate. June 2017, July 2022. And once, just 2 weeks before the murders. Always entering, never leaving with anything visible, but always showing up after Nick. It was enough. Enough for Tracy to believe that whatever Rob was protecting her from wasn't just inside the house. It was circling it. She started documenting everything, taking screenshots, saving files, encrypting data. She kept a backup of the flash drive in a lockbox at a separate bank. She met with a security consultant to sweep her house. And when he was done, he handed her something she hadn't expected. Found this behind your bookshelf. It was a tracker. Small, flat, magnetic. Someone had been following her inside her own home. That was the moment it all became real. Not paranoia, not panic. A target. Tracy wasn't just the daughter of a murder victim. She was now the keeper of a secret someone didn't want released. And whoever that someone was, they weren't finished. Because 2 days before the funeral, she received a message. Handwritten. No return address. Inside, if you speak, your children cry next. No signature, no explanation, just fear, folded into paper, delivered like a ghost. But Tracy didn't fold. She doubled down. She met with the lead detective, gave him the ledger, the flash drive, the letter, and the name Gavin. And that's when something unexpected happened. The detective's expression changed. He knew that name, not from this case, but from another, a cold case, a double homicide in Calabasas in 2015. Parents murdered, son charged, case dismissed for insufficient evidence. The son's lawyer? A man named Gavin J. Price. That connected the dots. A pattern, a method, a signature, and it suggested something terrifying. Nick may not have just snapped. He may have been guided, manipulated, turned by someone with experience and a script. So let me ask you this. If your father left you breadcrumbs, and your brother was the monster everyone feared, but someone else had handed him the knife, who would you go after? Tracy knew the answer, and she was about to act. But just as she prepared to expose everything, someone from her past resurfaced. Someone she thought was long gone, and what they had to say would make her question everything, even her own memory. How far would you go to protect your child, especially when that child might be the reason you're not alive to tell the story? Nick Reiner didn't wake up one morning and become a killer. That's not how these stories go. It's never sudden, it's never clean, and it's never without warning. Because in every family tragedy like this, there are signals, moments, red flags. And in Nick's case, there were hundreds. The only question is, why did no one stop him? Or maybe the harder question is, how do you stop someone when they're your own son? Let's go back before the guest house, before the will, before the voicemail, to the beginning. Nick Reiner, born 1991, raised in a home filled with creativity, activism, and legacy. He grew up around movie sets and high-powered meetings, surrounded by people who called his dad a genius and his mom a goddess. But even in his earliest years, there was tension. He was different, not just rebellious, unsettled, explosive. By the time he was 9, Nick had been suspended twice from private school. For what? Threats. To classmates. To teachers. One incident involved a kitchen knife found in his backpack. When asked why he had it, Nick reportedly said, to feel safer. At 9, the Reiners kept it quiet. Of course they did. They had the money, the influence, the desire to protect their image and their son. Therapy followed. Expensive specialists. Child psychologists flown in from New York. Reports that used phrases like attachment issues and early trauma response. But none of it helped. Nick didn't want help. He wanted control. By his teens, the situation was worse. Arrests, drug use, violent outbursts. In 2007, he was hospitalized after allegedly breaking a glass door during an argument with Michelle. The reports never made it to the press. They were buried, paid off. But inside the family, the fear was rising. And the person most terrified wasn't Rob. It was Michelle. In her journal, now part of the official case file, Michelle wrote in 2011, I used to see his eyes and think of Rob. Now I see nothing, just blankness. Like he's watching a scene, not living in it. She told friends she kept her bedroom door locked at night, that she had stopped wearing jewelry to bed, just in case Nick came in looking for it. And yet, she still hugged him at Christmas, still smiled in family photos, still said, I love you, even when he said nothing back. Because how do you stop loving your child, even when they scare you? By 2013, Nick had cycled through 5 rehab programs. Each one cost more than the last. Each one ended the same way. He'd leave early, or get kicked out, or fake compliance and relapse within weeks. Rob kept paying, kept hoping, kept telling Tracy, he's just lost. I was lost too once. Remember when I was drinking all the time? We pulled through. But Tracy wasn't convinced. Because Nick's darkness wasn't like Rob's. It wasn't self-destruction. It was targeted, directed, cold. Then came the video. Something that never made the public archive. But everyone in the family saw it. Nick, sitting in the guest house, staring into the camera. A handheld phone video. Date stamped 2016. His face tight. His tone calm. Everyone thinks they're smarter than me. They think I'm broken. I'm not. I'm just tired of pretending I'm part of this family. I'm not. I'm watching it fall apart. And when it does, they'll all say they didn't see it coming. He ends by looking away and whispering, but I'll still be here. He posted it to a private Vimeo account, then deleted it. But Romy saved it. She showed it to Tracy, and both of them went straight to Rob. Rob's reaction? Silence. Then, I'll talk to him. But according to Tracy, that talk never happened. Or if it did, it didn't matter. Because later that year, Rob rewrote the will for the first time. In the first clause he added, in the event that Nicholas Reiner is unable to meet the conditions outlined in Appendix B, all benefits allocated to him shall be redistributed to his surviving sisters. Appendix B required two things: psychological clearance from an independent mental health panel, submission to ongoing supervised treatment for a minimum of 36 months. Nick never knew about that clause until Rob told him, and that was when the real break happened. Family dinner stopped. Nick refused to attend birthdays. When Michelle was hospitalized for gallbladder surgery, Nick didn't visit. But he did text, "You're probably hoping I'm not in the will. You'll get your wish." That message was later found in her phone under the contact name, and Michelle never replied. Fast forward to 2019. Nick entered another facility, a luxury center in Malibu. It was the last one Rob paid for. After that, he told Nick the money was done. "You need to stand on your own. We've given you everything." Nick's response? He disappeared. For almost 8 months. No contact. Not with Rob. Not with Michelle. Not with his sisters. Then he showed up again. At the estate. In the guest house. No warning. No permission. Just there. And when Rob confronted him, Nick said, "It's mine anyway." From that moment on, the Reiner family lived in quiet lockdown. Tracy began visiting less. Romy stopped entirely. Rob and Michelle told friends they were managing things. But they weren't. They were surviving. Day by day, night by night. And Nick? He stayed in the guest house. Writing. Watching. Waiting. So how does this all connect to the murders? Motive. Means. Mindset. The guest house revealed intent. The will provided the spark. But Nick's past? That was the gasoline. Because this wasn't an impulsive act. This was decades in the making. A lifetime of resentment, rejection, and rage. And it all came to a head when Rob finally took away the one thing Nick believed he was owed: his inheritance. Let me ask you this. What would you do if the only way you could feel powerful again was by tearing down the people who gave you everything? That's what investigators believe happened. That's why the plan wasn't sloppy. Why there was no forced entry. Why the body showed no defensive wounds. Because Nick didn't come to fight. He came to end it. Quick. Final. Complete. But what about remorse? That's the twist. There was none. During initial questioning, Nick remained silent. Then, after 3 hours, he reportedly said, "I had no choice. They took everything." That statement, recorded and documented, became the backbone of the DA's argument. Because it confirmed one thing. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't confusion. It was retaliation. Cold-blooded. Surgical. Personal. And yet, somehow, Nick still had defenders. Old friends from rehab.